Okay, there we go. All right. Okay, welcome people as you are entering. Thank you for being at our presentation today. You got everybody in?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. 1 second. I'm just going to get my little paper here. Okay. My name is Laura McCluskey. I'm the program chair for Angie. With me today is Beth Stoling. She is the director of Angie. She'll be joining us. We're excited for today's workshop, Spiritual Eco-Literacy, Meaning Making and Pedagogy, as part of Angie's 37th Annual Winter Conference. And a special thank you to our conference sponsors, PSE&G, New Jersey Natural Gas, and our anonymous donor, who is a friend of science and environmental education in New Jersey, BASF, and also the Grounds for Sculpture, who are joining us this year as a sponsor and supporting our field experiences. We will be placing a link in our to our YouTube channel in the chat room, where you can see all of the recorded content of not only this conference, but past conferences, forums, and other sponsored events. That's all part of your package for being a part of this conference. And we hope you'll subscribe to the YouTube channel. So that will be in the chat. We ask everyone to keep themselves on mute throughout the presentation. If you have any questions or even comments, if you could just put them in the chat during the presentation, and we will get to them at the end. There will be time for questions live at the end of the presentation, when you can either raise your hand or you can use the hand raising icon, and we will get to your questions at the end. Okay, we're welcoming Dr. Mike Lees from Montclair State University. His program is Spiritual Eco-Literacy, and here's a bit of a description of it. Spiritual eco-literacy yokes Cosmosapien knowledge acquisition and meaning making with experiential learning using 3 lenses, thus creating the potential for transformation to occur in terms of individual responses to not only learning and application inside the classroom or at home, but also in life as well. Dr. Mike, welcome, and you can introduce yourself and we will get started.
Hey, good afternoon, everybody. My name's Mike. It's great to meet everybody here today. Great to read everybody's names, at least, up here on the screen. The word Cosmosapien kind of comes in there right at the beginning, just as a way of a kind of a brief definition behind that word. My wife and I are avid, self-admitted, we have a huge problem book addicts. Our home looks like a used bookstore, but there was one day we were over at Barnes & Noble getting ready to do our comb and sweep of everything book related. And as I was cruising through the science section on my way over to the philosophy section, I stopped short in my tracks. This word just jumped out at me. And I remember I keep it right here because it's like a really important thing. So there I am cruising through the book section, and this book was on the face out. If everybody can see that there, but this book was on the face out. And that word Cosmosapiens is nice, big old bold red letters right across the front of the book. That word stopped me dead in my tracks. It just hit me like a ton of bricks, and I went, wow, I could think of no other better way I've ever heard it said or offered for a way of labeling who we are. You know, human being is what we've been using for a very long time, but I've been kind of transitioning to using the word Cosmosapien all the time, because at once I felt this kind of deep connection to space and place. It was this kind of, on a very personal level, it just hit me like, wow, yeah, Cosmosapien. I am a being standing on a planet that's spinning very fast, moving through space very fast, in something we call a cosmos, right? And so here I am on that personal level going, wow, Cosmosapien. Yeah, that's who I am. As I here wiggle my fingers and think about my opposable thumbs and all that kind of fun stuff. And then in the same turn, I was like, wow, on a social level, that is an incredible way to cut across and through so many different identity divisions that we have with this thing we call language and labeling, right? When we talk about language and labeling, we use a lot of different descriptors to describe things. And when I saw the word Cosmosapien, I was like, well, that's a really holistic way to think about ourselves as beings. And then on that ecological level, yeah, for me in that moment, it connected Earth to cosmos. And it kind of had that kind of fun Carl Sagan moment where you're just pale blue dot, stardust, all that kind of fun stuff. So yeah, Cosmosapien, it's a word I've been dropping a lot and a word I've been using in my classroom a lot, and that idea of finding a word or finding a word through language that works towards the idea of recognizing interdependence or interbeing, or words that I like to use and describe there to go after Thich Nhat Hanh and some of Thich Nhat Hanh's teachings on ecology and the Zen of Earth and teachings along those lines. He uses the word interbeing to describe the nature of interdependence. And that's kind of something I've been working on for the last number of years. I've been here, tag that up for it. It's called Cosmosapiens, right, is the name of the book. And then the author for that is John Hens. Is the author's name. Great book, fun book. It's a kind of a timeline of evolution and history as far as life and living on planet Earth goes. So yeah, Cosmosapien by John Hens. So yeah, I've been using that word in my classroom a lot, and I've been, presenting here at Angie for a good number of years now since finishing my dissertation. And my dissertation had to do with eco-literacy. And so what you're getting from me today has been a personal evolutionary process of exploring eco-literacy and being able to use eco-literacy for pedagogical reasons, rhymes and reasons. And for me, I try to work with that from grade levels, pre-KK all the way up through college, in this idea of eco-literacy. Now, spiritual eco-literacy. I added a word here. My initial studies had to do with eco-literacy. Eco-literacy is a word that was coined by Fritjof Capra at one point in time, as well as David Orr. Orr and Capra worked together for a little while at one stage of the game. They're looking at educational paradigms and thinking about this idea of, well, how do we work with introducing ecological thinking into mainstream? How do you make that work? The word they popped out was eco-literacy, right? Now, eco-literacy, by definition, means learning how to read the world using your head, heart, hands, and spirit. Okay, is the way that they define this. And when they say learning how to read the world, eco-literacy doesn't mean you're reading Thoreau. Eco-literacy means you're literally reading the forest. You're literally reading the city. You're literally reading, it's taking that idea of reading and becoming literate means understanding. Right? So eco-literacy from this perspective is learning how to read your environment, how to read the world you find yourself in, whatever that environment might be. It doesn't necessarily have to be the beautiful natural world environment per se. It could also be when you're hanging out in traffic. Eco-literacy, learning how to read the world. Using your head, heart, hands, and spirit is kind of the guiding paradigmatic force of their kind of the theoretical premise for that, and the idea that the head in this context represents looking at it from the cognitive perspective. The brain and the mind, things along those lines, are working with information processing, gathering of information. So from this standpoint, it's a purely objective view. Okay, this idea of eco-literacy and the way they introduced it was to say, objectively speaking, you're learning how to read the world using your head, heart, hands, and spirit. So you're objectively studying how your mind and consciousness works with gathering information through the head. The heart and how they define the heart in eco-literacy gets into the idea of intelligence. So you have this information, you've gathered this knowledge, you've gathered this information. Now the heart's going to go to work. The heart basically in this particular kind of context has that idea of the development of intelligence, what to do with the information. It's one thing to have information, it's another thing to know what to do with the information. So the heart is working with that idea of taking that information and crafting it into a form of intelligence. Here they talk about social intelligence, emotional intelligence, ecological intelligence, and I throw in there spiritual intelligence, coming from that kind of perspective, but what to do with the information that you have. Now, of course, the idea here is that that information cannot really be worked well unless there's the experiential aspect coming into play. It's one thing to have the information, it's one thing to think about what to do with the information, but the third element, hands. It is through experience and hands-on experience that you begin to test that knowledge, work with that knowledge, and see how that knowledge works in your space and place, right? For you as a human being, what does that look like? So you have the information gathering, you have the knowledge. Now you begin to think about, well, what am I going to do with that knowledge? It's one thing to think, but now you need to do. So hands is where they introduce the experiential paradigm, and this is where you'll hear from from the School of Ecoliteracy and people working with this and everything, a lot of this has to do with the idea of using experiential education, outdoor education, that idea of the very Deweyan perspective, without sense-based contact and without that idea of hands-on, that knowledge isn't going to go anywhere, and you won't really know what to do with it unless you actually just get in the dirt and test it. Okay, so you have head, heart, hands. Spirit is the other word that they use on the tail end of this. Now, when they define spirit, okay, for the word ecoliteracy here, it's originally introduced by them as language. They say, well, it's through language, that all these connections get made, right? And that idea of language being our form of communication. So head, heart, hands, and language, right? The language they're basically saying you have the knowledge, you have the information, you're testing what to do with that information, hopefully developing the intelligence along the way. And then now you know how to talk about it. Now you know how to bring it. Now you know how to present it. Now you know how to work with it in your life. Okay. Now, again, in the traditional defining of this by them, they put it out there as this is objective. They're saying objectively speaking and working with it from an objective standpoint. And for me, this was great. When I first discovered this, I'm like, wow, this is fantastic stuff and everything. But the further and further I began to delve and dig, because I am a person who comes from a religion, philosophy, and science background. I'm a very eclectic Cosmosapien. When it comes to schools of learning, I love schools of learning from all different directions. So yeah, I have this very big blend in my own background of religious philosophy, Eastern and Western, indigenous, and science. I have a very big ecology background, right? So this is what, kind of flew me around in this direction. As I'm looking at this and I'm looking at this and I'm thinking about it, I'm like, there's an element missing here. And I'm like, well, what about the subjective? Right? What about our subjective response to life and living? When we say objective, we're talking about that idea with as little bias as possible, trying to let things be just as they are, type of an without any feeling for, in that kind of context. And I'm like, well, but to me, there's something still incomplete about this if you don't have the subjective connection, because a lot of who we are is also a very strong felt response to life, right? To me, that felt response to life, without that idea of bringing the subjective to the objective, wisdom might not happen. Right? The idea of having knowledge, testing knowledge, is hopefully you develop wisdom, right? That's the magic equation for any Cosmosapien wandering around here on planet Earth in that kind of sense. Whether or not we develop wisdom, that's always an up in the air question. But the idea here is that without that subjective punch in there, without that idea of connecting the felt response, the emotive response that we have as the beings that we are, that this might remain incomplete. Right? Because one thing we can do is, yes, we can experience our lives objectively. We can look at it objectively, but we're also not robots, right? We're also felt beings. We have the ability to laugh and cry and feel things and get into things as human beings, things that feel good, things that feel bad, all that kind of jazz. So what I kind of stumbled on for myself over the last couple of years here is like, well, I want to take that word spiritual, that idea of the language aspect that they dropped on the tail end of ecoliteracy, and add it and call this spiritual ecoliteracy, right? Now, this is a fun one to weigh into, because, when we talk about dropping the word spiritual in the world of academia, that tends to make people run in that way, shape, and form. And one thing I very strongly argued here, or have been arguing about introducing this type of an idea and everything, is that spiritual here doesn't necessarily have a religious connotation. Okay, when I'm defining spiritual in this kind of context, I'm kind of defining it in a different way. Here's that idea of this can be divorced from a religious purview. When you think about, well, what is the word spiritual? What does the word spiritual mean? The way I kind of worked a definition for it is to basically say it's the uniquely creative expression of humans, Cosmosapiens, taking a particular teaching or teachings, any teachings, and bringing them to life in an engaged effort involving commitment, purpose, and dedication. That's a big part of who we are, right? Such efforts support the establishment of meaning making, connection, and motivation. So this is where I also come flying into some of Maslow's work and all that kind of jazz and everything, and get into it from that perspective. But the uniquely creative expression of humans taking a particular teaching, and this is why I say this is something that can be applicable to any discipline, any field of learning, any field of schooling, any field of learning that we do as the beings that we are, but taking a particular teaching and then bringing them to life in an engaged effort. When you talk about that idea of in an engaged effort, when we feel passionate about something, when we feel strongly about something, when we feel for something, we do end up in our own special ways creating a sense of commitment. And it is through that sense of commitment that we find that idea of purpose and motivation, being the kind of idea here that, yeah, as the beings that we are, we're very purpose driven. You know, the idea of why do I get myself out of bed every morning? It is a little more than just to walk my dog, but it is also to walk my dog in sub-zero temperatures and realize it's really cold outside, type of an idea. But yeah, it's this idea of commitment, purpose, and then there's an idea of dedication here. You know, being in the field of teaching or being a student in that kind of context all takes a heavy duty level of dedication. To frame that in the environmental context of the way our world looks today, it takes a lot of commitment, purpose, and dedication in working with what is happening with planet Earth right now. And that's why I've come out very strongly arguing at this stage of the game that if we do not find a balance between the objective forms of learning and the subjective forms of learning and find that same interbeing between objective and subjective, learning is always going to fall short of being able to develop wisdom. So that's my argument, you know, is this idea that without connecting or yoking together the objective and subjective, all of our efforts are going to constantly continue to fail. There needs to be that healthy balance of both. The science is very important. The philosophy is very important. And then in the same turn, how the felt responses and how we move and feel moved by something in that idea of information gathering, right? You know, is the way that I think about that. So that's where I think about the word spiritual, right? So again, to me, can one be religious without being spiritual? Can one be spiritual without being religious? Absolutely. Can this idea of spiritual be applied to the many different disciplines of learning that we have for ourselves as human beings? Yes, in the context of spiritual, basically meaning purpose-driven, dedication, meaning-making. You know, one of the most beautiful things I think of as far as who we are as Cosmosapiens type of an idea is that notion of meaning making, right? We are storytelling beings. You know, to me, the stories that we tell are an incredibly beautiful thing. You know, our understandings of our relationship to life and the cosmos and everything began with mythology, began with creation stories, began with all these different ways of trying to describe who we are as we watch a yellow disc move around in the sky. Then the stories of science come and begin to say, well, here, this is, now we can really begin to know some really down home nitty gritty stuff about the nature of reality. And then all this getting yoked together with how we feel, right? And how we bring that notion of feeling to it. So from that standpoint, spiritual ecoliteracy is ecoliteracy infused with meaning making, purpose, and motivation. Spiritual ecoliteracy is individually and collectively developed ecoliteracy that understands the underlying motivations that drive human purpose and meaning making. So yeah, you know, one way that I break this down, I'm like, well, how can something like this be used to read the world, right? You know, again, ecoliteracy, learning how to read the world with our head, heart, hands, and spirit language, and now this idea of spiritual ecoliteracy being yoked to it. Well, one way I thought about that is, hey, there's three lenses you can use here. There, you know, this idea of putting on a set of glasses. You know, there's three lenses that can be used here to address this idea of spiritual ecoliteracy. The first lens is on the personal level, right? So lens number one is, put this up here for you. Personal. Lens number one is the personal level, the personal lens. This is the idea that if you're approaching a particular topic, if you're approaching a particular teaching or a particular discipline, the idea here is to look at that topic on the personal level. What is this teaching you about you? You know, the idea of the personal level here in this kind of context is that idea, well, what is it teaching me about relating to myself and relating inwardly, right, would be the way to think about this. So if we're studying, say, for example, a riverbed, or if we're looking at a freshwater biome, or if we're hanging out on a city street type of an idea, on the personal level, what's going on for me here? To take a look around, what am I feeling internally? What's getting triggered internally here? What am I understanding about myself, okay, as I'm standing here experiencing this particular moment and whatever it happens to be? Or if this is in the classroom, how does this relate to a teaching in business, or teaching in ecology, or teaching in philosophy? On that personal level, hit that personal level, ask those questions of who, what, where, why, when, and how on that personal level. This is that idea of, yeah, well, what's happening internally here based on what I'm experiencing out here as I'm learning how to read my place in space, right? The next lens, okay, lens number two, is, you know, the social. Okay, the next lens is social, personal, social. Next lens is this idea of, okay, well, we got that personal level established. Socially speaking, what am I learning in this particular teaching or learning in this particular space and place as it relates to me and what's going on around me, self and other? Now, when we define or think about this idea of self and other in this kind of context, the idea here of other can be anything. Other can be the teaching we're looking at in this particular moment. Other could be the dog. Other could be the squirrel. Other could be the river. Other could be the stream. Other could be the ocean, the lakes, the sky. In that sense, when we talk about that idea of social, the questions that are being asked here too through that social lens is, well, what are my actions and what are my activities experiencing and feeling based on what's one coming from the outside, and then two, what am I spitting back? When it comes to that idea of understanding relationships. So social takes it to that idea of looking at interdependence or interrelatedness, or that idea of interbeing. Okay, that idea of how the personal and social actually work as one and the same, as far as that idea of creating either positive or negative feedback loops, right? Or working it from that kind of direction. The third lens is going to be Sorry, the print on my computer is really tiny and I'm blind these days. Ecological. Okay, so you got personal, social, and ecological. So the third lens that I throw down here for this idea of spiritual literacy is the ecological lens. Ecology, the study of systems, the study of interdependence, the study of the parts that make up the systems, that systems are more than just the sum of their parts. When you talk about ecological and the ecological lens, this is kind of situating it and structuring it in the personal and social dynamic meets the world. The idea that you have the little picture, big picture. So it goes from the personal to the ecological with the social in between. The social in between, to me, is where we find that bridge between ourselves and the world. And we will find that through each other. We find it through ourselves, and we find it through our space and place, right? Our space and place establishes feelings of connection or disconnection based on what we're experiencing. So the personal to the social to the ecological is the big picture think. So if I'm thinking about using something like this in the classroom, the idea, one example I can give you is this idea of a personal, social, ecological. One teaching that I use with the students in the classroom is the shirt on their backs. I will ask them, hey, the shirt on your back, where does it come from? Did you make it? And of course, you get all the head, nobody sitting on your loom at home spinning the wheel. Did you shear the sheep before you put that sweater on? Oh, no. Okay, so where does your shirt come from? And the classic answer might be, well, it comes from China, or it comes from Taiwan, it comes from overseas type of an idea. And I'm like, okay, so let's basically look at that for a second. Why'd you get it? Oh, I liked it. So personal level. Well, I liked it. It's a great shirt. It kind of speaks for who I am, blah, 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 blah. So I'll ask them about, okay, so on that personal level, you dug the shirt. So you got it. It was affordable and you were able to do that for yourself. On the social level, okay, so let's begin to look at what kind of cause and effect is taking place here in you going after and buying that shirt. What is that doing in the social dynamic? And you're like, well, I guess in buying the shirt, I bought it at the store, and the person working at the store is going to be able to hopefully eat because of me purchasing this shirt today. So on a social level, boom, there's an interconnection instantly established here where your choice is now creating cause and effect. Your choice is now creating kind of this chain reaction that's going to take place here. And it's going to move from a personal to the local to the global level. So personal, social, and ecological is also going after that idea of personal, local, global. Okay, and thinking about it in that kind of context. So that social dynamic, well, yeah, in the immediate exchange here. But let's look at this ecologically for a second. How much more cause and effect do you think is happening here? And this is where they really get into it, because then they're like, whoa, okay, so then it's going to extend beyond that store, right? You got to think about where it came from. Right. So hopefully your purchase today is going to help somebody eat who's maybe what you just told me on the other side of the world. Right. That person's going to eat on the other side of the world. What's that going to look like for them? In order for that shirt to get here in the first place, what had to go down? And this is where we'll spend the next 15 minutes chunking that stuff down like nobody's business. Well, first you had the people who have to harvest the material to make the clothing. Then you have to have the people who are going to take that material that's been harvested to put it on the trucks to send it to the place that's going to put that clothing together. But then you have to have the people who make the trucks put the trucks together. But in order to make the trucks, you're going to have to get the people who do the tires. In order to make the tires, you're going to have to go cut down these trees. In order to cut down those trees, you're going to have to get these. And so by the time, we kind of hit the idea that by the time the shirt is done from wherever it's being made, now it needs to be put on a ship. Now you have to have the people who build the ship. You have to have all the people who make the nuts and bolts and the washers for the ship. And then that ship's got to sail across the waters. But in order for that ship to sail across the waters, it's got to go get all that oil and gasoline. In order to get all that oil, and so on and so on and so on and so on and so on. And then it comes to the New Jersey harbors. And then you have to have the people who build the New Jersey harbors. But then before you even get it from the New Jersey harbors, it's going to have to go on more trucks. And then it's going to have to go from more trucks. It's going to have to go to the store. But if you're going to have a store, you got to have a mall. If you're going to have a mall, you got to have it. And then so by the time it gets you all the way back around from this full big old picture perspective to that moment where you're exchanging your $4 or $5 or $20 or whatever it is for that shirt, your action today went from the personal to a global level, whether you're aware of it or not. Okay, so eco-literacy and spiritual eco-literacy in this kind of context is to also ground that in meaning making. So if you're going to go buy that shirt, right, we're going to ground this in this idea of meaning making and thinking about cause and effect and thinking about how our actions have cause and effect in this life and in this world. In that notion of meaning making, yeah, the action ultimately speaking is helping the idea of is at the end of the day, this entire exchange helping everyone involved get food, clothing, and shelter. Right, to bring it down to that basic rudimentary survival level in that particular moment is are you aware of where your clothing is coming from? What is the background of the company? Is the people who actually made the shirt even going to see a dime of this? And that's where I hear students talk about, yeah, you blah blah. Nike at one point in time got busted for this, and Gap got busted for this, and blah 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 blah. It's like, yeah, do you know where this stuff comes from? And they walk away with this idea of, wow, I've never thought about it that way before. And that's the most magic words you can ever hear as a teacher. They said it, but yeah, I never thought about it this way before, because again, there's this idea of you throw out $4 and you want your cheap t-shirt, but your cheap t-shirt's going to have cause and effect. So one way that I introduce this idea of spiritual eco-literacy is to be able to create those kinds of aha moments for students, to have that kind of aha moment of like, wow, ding, light bulb goes off. This isn't just me. This affects everything around me. This also ultimately affects me. Right, in that way, shape, and form. So it's this idea of going from personal, local to global, using this personal, social, and ecological lens, and then introducing through each lens different pedagogy or different ways of working with those teachings in order to be able to kind of draw out that aha moment for students, right? To have them have that kind of light bulb go off and go, wow, I never really thought about buying a shirt having such a deep impact. Right, such a deep way of thinking. I also come from a very strong deep ecology background and everything. So part of this idea of spiritual eco-literacy in this moment too is about that idea of being able to go below just the surface, right? To be able to dive, with the philosophical background that's also kind of infused into this theoretical thinking I got going on here. It involves critical thinking. It does. It involves that idea of asking the good questions, asking the tough questions, asking the deep questions, to be able to really delve and dive into, what is the meaning making? What is the purpose? What level of commitment does it take to see that this is happening in a good way? To think about it ecologically, what does buying that shirt do environmentally speaking? What does that shirt do on a social level for all the humans involved, right? For all the people involved? And then, at the end of the day, what does it do for you? Can you feel good at the end of the day about what you're wearing on your back, knowing what you know about where it comes from, who made it, what the whole deal is, right? So it's that idea of creating, at the same time, working with the notion of sustainability, but doing it with mindfulness and purpose, having that level of mindfulness. Mindfulness, to me, in that sense, helps develop that notion of critical thinking, right? To be able to think critically in that idea of asking the right kinds of questions, to be able to dive deep into something, to also to have no fear in finding out what you might get as answers, right? To work with that idea of, well, if the answers aren't quite what you were looking for, then what needs to change? Kind of had that conversation with some students in a class this morning, because one student said, I just really want things to go back to normal. And right now I hear that and I just cringe. There's a part of me that goes, and I actually whipped around in class and I went, I don't. And they're all just kind of like, what do you mean? And I'm like, I don't want to go back to normal. Why? And they're like, why? Why do you mean you don't want to go back to normal? Like, normal is what got us to where we are right now. I don't want to do normal again. If that's normal, I don't want to repeat what just happened, right? This is an opportunity to create change. We need to change. Obviously, something was not working that we find ourselves in this space and place. Right? So they're like, oh, I'll go back to normal. And I do. For me, it was such a knee-jerk reaction this morning. Like, no. And they're like, whoa, type of an idea. I'm like, I don't want to go back to normal. Normal's how we got here. What we have here is an opportunity. What we have here is an opportunity to dive into that personal, social, ecological, and go, well, what within the systems are not working? that needs to change, that we find ourselves in this situation because, again, normal, it didn't work. We can always get into the philosophical question of define normal to begin with, but that's a whole nother conversation for another day. But yeah, it's that idea of making that contact for them in that moment, grounding it personally, grounding it socially, and grounding it ecologically, in that idea of learning how to make the connections, learning how to see that, yeah, what I do has cause and effect, whether I'm thinking about it or not, right? Whether or not it's coming into my field of experience for awareness or not. Now, the practice of spiritual ecology, the idea here is like, if this is being used as a pedagogy, or this is being used as a way to generate knowledge and meaning making and working towards that idea of hopefully achieving wisdom in our lives as human beings, what are some of the things that I see that helps with this? Well, one, I think knowledge building can increase. When it comes to that idea of connecting knowledge with experience, we tend to remember things more. As the beings that we are, we tend to remember better this idea of knowledge once knowledge is truly tested, right? So there's their capacity to build that kind of knowledge to help students or help people understand the actual connections that exist between everything we do on a personal, social, and ecological level. To bring mindful awareness to that idea of interdependence, interrelatedness, that, yeah, the exchange of money and everything just for a t-shirt has interdependent cause and effect, an interbeing related notion of cause and effect. And then, yeah, again, the fruition of this, hopefully acquired knowledge and the manifestation of wisdom in our lives as human beings, is one way that that's thought of. Now, an assignment that I've used over the last number of years in my classroom that I've given to students has been something I call a tree journal. I use a tree journal. And what I created for the students was an entire exercise that runs for the course of the semester. So basically what the students will do in a nutshell is that the students will basically have to find a tree either on campus or around home. And what they're going to do is befriend that tree for the entire semester. They're going to make friends with this tree. They're going to hang out with this tree. One of the very first assignments is, well, what is your tree friend's name? What does your tree friend look like? And I ask them to either draw or take a picture of the tree type of an idea. I've gotten paintings from students of their trees over the years and stuff like that. But I'll ask them, you're going to introduce your tree. And what I'll do with this tree journal is over the course of the semester, there's a whole bunch of guided questions that every other week or every 2 weeks, they're going to go hang out with their tree and answer a series of questions. That series of questions will begin with the personal, move into the social, and then move into the ecological by the end. Okay, so it's a tree journal, and then the subtitle of the tree journal is, if a you fell in the forest, would you make a sound? In that way, shape, and form. So the journal exercise itself and the questions that I use in that journal steer them in that direction of personal, social, and ecological. But what I do as far as the tree journal is I leave it completely student-centered. I'm a giant John Dewey philosopher. But what I do is I leave the teaching is student-centered, and what I basically tell them, you got free license. However you want to make this happen is up to you. You can use dance, you can use music, you can use art, you can use poetry, you can use prose, you can just answer it like essays if you want to, type of an idea. So I give them free license. However you want to manifest your relationship and your conversation with this tree, go for it. And I've gotten great stuff from the students over the semesters. Amazing. I have collections of paintings around me. I've gotten poetry. I've gotten one student was a comic strip artist, and he actually did a whole comic strip. So I looked forward to that every 3 weeks. I can't wait to read the newest comic. In that way, shape, and form. I've gotten oil painting on canvas from students. I've gotten music. That's students that have been musicians, did the conversation through song and through music as opposed to just verbal dialogue. So it's a full creativity oriented exercise as well, because that's the other thing that I also think about with spiritual ecoliteracy is tackling and getting into creativity and having creativity be a part of that, and actually using the word creativity in there, because creativity is how we work with problem solving. The other aspect of this notion of spiritual ecoliteracy is to work with the notion of problem solving, because again, that's another part of our dynamic, part of our learning experience for ourselves as human beings, is to work with that idea of problem solving. I also infuse that journal assignment with different prose and poems from a lot of the great nature writers that are out there, and from a lot of indigenous elders that are out there, and from a lot of Buddhist teachers that are out there and stuff like that, to also show that there are other ways to think about ecological science that might not actually just be in the language of science. A lot of people have been doing ecology in a lot of different schools for a very long time, and it doesn't necessarily just have to sound like the Western ecological science. So I do use a lot of other teachings that do come from other cultures and stuff like that, that also express ecological based teachings. It's just in a different language, right? You know, is the way that that's thought of in that sense. So that tree journal is one way that I do something like that. The other example being the shirt, you know, using the T-shirt example with students in class. You know, my wife does it with her kids. You know, she's been in bringing some of these ideas to her classroom and stuff like that. She does it with the ladybug projects that she has going on in that way. But again, it's that idea of really helping the learner be able to connect on a personal, social, and ecological level, or personal, local, global level. Okay, and that idea of expanding that notion of community, one, having a healthy relationship with self, because it's very important. To me, that's not selfish, it's taking care of self. If you're not taking care of self, it's going to be very hard to go out there and do anything for anybody else in this world. So to me, that's not the word selfish, doesn't apply here. Taking care of self is that, yeah, there's a healthy balance that needs to be stricken between you and place and space. And if that's not happening in your own internal dialogue, it's not going to happen out here. And I always tell my students, I even use it this morning, where I'm like, hey, you know, you ever wonder who you talk to when you're talking to yourself? You ever wonder what's going on with that internal dialogue, and you have all those arguments? Yes, no, do it, don't do it, all that kind of stuff. Well, yeah, it's about making a relationship with that voice, that internal dialogue, that inner voice. It's about being comfortable with that inner voice, and resting with that inner voice, and being confident with that inner voice to know what you need to do in this life. Of course, that's not a perfection thing, but it's that idea of being able to work with failure and success, trial and error from a healthy direction, right? You know, to have it infused with that, again, that idea of meaning making and purpose, so that even if you fall, you have something to fall back on, as opposed to falling into a void, right? So that idea of spiritual ecoliteracy, bringing that objective and subjective experience together of who we are, I think is very important. You know, again, people are like, oh, Mike, be careful about dropping the word spiritual. I'm done being careful. We're not in a world anymore that being careful is going to help anybody at this stage of the game. So it is that idea of, yes, I think spiritual is very, very, very important, you know, and that idea of being grounded in that dynamic of meaning making, and having that idea of a felt response to what we feel. If people felt more about a tree, less trees would get cut down, you know, as opposed to just seeing it as a product, or seeing it as a thing to consume, you know, in that kind of context. I get great responses from the kids at the end of the semester, where they're sitting there going, I'm going to miss my freaking tree. I'm like, excellent. Glad to hear it. You know, your tree is still probably going to be standing there for a very long time. It's not, you know, they move a little slower than we do. And they're like, oh, that's right, I'm going to come back and visit my tree, blah, 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 blah. And you hear that at the end, you know, and you hear them expressing at the end, like, wow. And then you also have that light bulb go off at the end of the semester. It's like, wow, I was really talking to myself this entire time, wasn't I? You know, in that way, shape. Or you also have the reaction of, wow, I never thought hanging out with a tree would be so much fun. My tree had an amazing perspective on existence. It's like, wow, nice. That kind of stuff makes me smile as a teacher all the time, because there's creativity. There's that idea of lighting up life, of having that bigger connection to life in that kind of way, shape, and form. You know, you're dropping that info over there, Ann, and I was just, you know, my wife and I were just talking yesterday. We were wondering if you fave Trash Man the other day, and his meeting with Subaru actually worked out, because wasn't Subaru going to do some kind of deal where they were going to be planting the trees? So yeah, we've been sitting around kind of in suspense, waiting to hear from your fave Trash Man over there, whether or not the Subaru deal worked out for getting all those trees planted. You know, you talk about that idea of getting your town and stuff like that. We have a lot of people laughing in our neighborhood here, because we are the kooks on the corner with the forest. You know, when I moved back here from living out west and going to school out west for a while and stuff like that, one thing I sorely missed was hanging out in the freaking Rocky Mountains. And I kind of had this idea of, well, if I can't live in the forest right now where I live, I'm going to plant one. So we're the kooks on the corner with about 14, 15 different kinds of evergreens and leaf trees on our property. And everybody just kind of smiles when they look by our house, because, yeah, we have a small forest in the middle of suburbia here. And our trees are some of the only trees in the area. And in the last number of years, we've watched a lot of animals love it and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, it is that idea of trying to bring that personal, social, and ecological experience together for students in kind of a holistic fashion, a holistic version of learning. And yeah, this is what I've been throwing out there. I've introduced this idea through a couple books that I've been fortunate enough to get out over the last year or two here. And there's a PDF handout for this particular session. And that handout's actually an excerpt from a book that I just got published this past week, which I'm really excited about, called Global Compass, Morality and Ethics. And so, I apply this idea of looking at spiritual ecoliteracy through that lens of morality and ethics, through that idea of what is a global compass. And then I frame that in some environmental perspectives. And then I also tackle some of the educational paradigms in that book, in that idea of looking at, okay, so what are some learning theories and how can we work with learning theories in this kind of context? Yeah, it's been really exciting. I got 2 books out in the last 2 years. One is a Religions of the World, Spirituality and Practice book. And then there's this one, Global Compass, Morality and Ethics. And neat thing about that is this whole work with spiritual ecoliteracy for me is also a constant work in progress, because the other thing to talk about with that notion of spiritual ecoliteracy that way is I also try to impress upon the students, one of the most important things you can remember is everything's always changing. Right? That's why don't necessarily get used to normal. Normal can go wrong, type of an idea. But if you can be at peace with the fact that everything's still changing, there's a way to work with change when it comes up in our lives, right? So even in that idea of scaffolding, I first started out by studying ecoliteracy, and now that my adventure with it is kind of scaffolding and moving as it goes along in this particular moment to, okay, spiritual ecoliteracy, in that way. Now, the whole tree journal thing too, I've been doing work with the group called Prime or Leap, Sustainability Mindset, and it's connected to the United Nations. And we just recently put together a book called Revolutionizing Sustainability Education, through a sustainability mindset. And in that book, it is teachers from around the world sharing different exercises and pedagogies that they use in their classrooms. Everything I just told you about that tree journal is now a chapter in that book, including the comic strips from that kid, and stuff like that. But yeah, it's another great read. Kind of put all these on the reference list there for if you wanted to check them out and everything. But yeah, there's a lot of work happening with all these kinds of thoughts and ideas right now, which has left me very excited. I've been sitting here, the 2 books that I just got out on my own over the last couple of years is kind of what I did with the pandemic time, being quarantined, is I kind of wrote about the last 20 years of everything I've been doing and getting into. So that's, one way I thought about, well, what can I do with the pandemic since I'm not in the classroom? I'm here online with the students all the time and everything. But at the same time, what can I offer while I'm quarantined? So again, for me, that idea of that personal, social, ecological has been with me all my life. And that idea of, well, what way as an educator, what way as someone who works with teaching and learning, can I share that? Can I bring that too? And that's why I kind of framed it in this idea of importantly tagging that word spiritual on there to express meaning making, storytelling, purpose, commitment, dedication, right? Kind of coming out of it from that side. So yeah, that's pretty much what I had to say there. I know there's a lot. I can kind of talk fast sometimes. I get very excited about stuff, especially in environments like this. When I'm hanging out with other folks who are into teaching and learning and all that kind of jazz. My wife's always like, Mike, remember to breathe. But yeah, I just get very excited.
That was fantastic, Mike. I was just going through the chat, and I think you kind of responded to everyone's comments. Although I'll point out Stephanie's comment. I wish I could be in your class as a student. This is all amazing.
Oh,
that's fantastic.
No.
Did you see Danny's comment to Speak for the Trees by Diana Beresford Kroger is very insightful. Oh, go ahead.
No, I'm learning how to use my new progressive lenses.
Oh.
Speaking of change and aging, to Speak for the Trees by Diana Kroger is very, I've not heard that one. I have to check that out. Or some Finding the Mother Tree. Okay, I have to check those out. No, I do not know those 2 titles.
If anyone has any questions to put into the chat, or if you wanted to raise your hand.
There were 2 questions. I don't know if anyone's hand is raised, but I have 2 questions that were pre-made. Okay, so we can start with that. First one is, what is the importance of spiritual ecoliteracy in 2022?
Ah, I thought about that since I wrote it, and I realized that list of answers can keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger as we're
Yeah,
rolling along here, as
yeah.
we're sitting here on the verge of war with Russia at this stage of the game, or thinking about volcanoes going off under the ocean, or
Mhm.
thinking about the sub-zero temperatures like I've never experienced this morning when I walked out my door, the fires going on out west that are burning through the winter, the mass extinction events that are taking place for other species that live on this planet. Where do we begin? The idea of looking at our economic situation at this stage of the game, the all-out assault on education at the moment.
Yeah.
It's challenging. It's really hard, and that's one reason why I think this idea can really do a lot to help ground or help with that, and that idea of just one, remembering to kind of step back, have that objective perspective, so that you can tune into how you subjectively feel. And that's something I feel a lot from my students right now as we're coming. This is one of my first semesters back, and one of the wild things is that we're sitting there looking at each other like deer in headlights right now over these masks, right? And it's just like, hi, yeah, everything we've known about life has gone poof, in that way. And right now, a lot of life is also telling us where everything is wrong. And so where I really feel strongly about this is it's a way to help learning, objectively speaking, connecting that subjective response to it, so that you do remember what you are learning, so that it does go from the classroom to the world, and it doesn't just go in one ear and out the other ear kind of thing, or it's not rote learning, in that way. The idea here being, again, is it's only through that aspect of making the connections, having that connection. And I do think it is very important right now. I cannot say more important than ever before. But yeah, I do think it is very important right now as we find ourselves in the world that we are in. Our relationships to one another are very hard right now. There's a lot of stuff happening in our society. There's a lot of opinion. There's a lot of hate. There's a lot of anger. There's a lot of rage. There's a lot of division. And I can't help constantly feeling like I'm in a state of everything's on a simmer right now and on a boil, and everything's just kind of. And so the whole idea is, how do you sit here when everything's doing this and go, okay, how do I gain perspective in all of this kind of pressure cooker we find ourselves in as human beings? Another exercise that I do use with my students is I do a 5-minute mindfulness exercise to the beginning of every one of my classes, where we just sit for 5. We just sit and we follow our breathing for 5 minutes. I use a bell that I sound for the beginning of the 5 minutes, and I use a bell to sound for the end. And it's an exercise of just sitting and being present for a moment. I call it sit for 5. I literally call it sit for 5. This is your chance to just sit for 5. Take a breather, breathe, remember, just to allow yourself to be with space. I'm a 2000. See, I've been almost 12 years now, I want to say, maybe 2010 or 11. I am terrible with linear time. I am not a linear time being. So I would say definitely more than a decade at this stage of the game. But yeah, that sit for 5 exercise is one exercise I also use with this idea of spiritual ecoliteracy, that idea of just being with space and place, personal, social, ecological. That sit for 5, bringing that idea of decompression, that I even told them this morning, because I introduced the sit for 5 this morning. I said, chances kind of go and just let all that air out, just let it out for a second, because the only thing you have to do right now is just be. Nothing more, nothing less. All you got to do is just sit here and follow your breathing. And that's another thing students have really come to enjoy over the years. I have been using that exercise for 20 years now. And I have had students that will come back semesters later, if they're still in school, and say, Professor, I don't have class with you this semester, but I'm on my way to my other class, which meets 15 minutes from now, but can I just do the sit for 5? With the class. So I've had students return just to come and hang out for that 5 minutes again. I've had students write me emails years later saying, yo, I've used that sit for 5 in so many different situations in my life. I had one that went on to be a coach, and he's got his whole team doing it. And they say, when we go into those games, we play well, and all that kind of, but it's that idea of grounding. Part of what I'm really trying to introduce with this idea of spiritual ecoliteracy is that idea of being able to ground what we teach and ground what we learn, in that idea of experiential, in that idea of being in touch with it through what we know, knowledge, objective, and then how we feel, subjective, emotive, in that way. And then hopefully through that idea, the connection is a greater awareness and maybe hopefully a greater respect and a greater level of sharing for this life that we live together as human beings. Yeah.
Very good. Are there any other questions from the audience? If you want to unmute.
Yeah, nature does give
Shouldn't
us a
focus,
wonderful
yeah.
outlet to focus. Absolutely.
Yeah. I think that was it, right, from the audience? Okay. It was just interesting when you were saying that, you know, taking that few minutes time for yourself. And our young people don't know that because they've grown up in this fast-paced society, high school and college kids. And that is really what I think 2022 is going to bring us back to. With all the things in our society that sort of are shifting us into a new direction. I think it's going to shift us, and I'm an optimist.
Oh
So
yeah,
I
me
think
too. I'm a diehard. My wife and I call ourselves, we're extreme optimists.
Yeah, I'm gonna. Yeah, so,
Yeah, I am always full of hope. Yeah, I really
yeah,
am.
yeah, and I think
really,
it's going to shift us into a better understanding of ourselves, of course, but then hopefully of the world around us as well. Look at the supply chain issue, right? So everybody can't get their favorite English muffin at a store, and now you're worried about how it gets here, where it comes from, who's holding it up, and why can't I have it?
what happens when it's gone? Yeah.
What happens when it's gone? And that's perfectly all right, even if it's a selfish reason. People now know that there are ships sitting off the coast of California that are holding our things hostage. And that's sort of that's the kind of wake-up calls that I'm seeing all around us these days.
That's a question I'll ask my students. I'm like, how many here, are able to do your own loaf of bread? It's like, how many, able to do, and they also look at me like, and they're like, well, you got to get, all you got to do, you get the flour, you get the, I go, no, where are you getting the flour? Where's that flour? And I break it down like, when's the last time, you butchered your cow for dinner? When's the last time you plucked the feathers from a chicken for your dinner?
Yeah.
Did you grow your broccoli? And they all just kind of get this look of like, oh yeah, you walk into Stop and Shop, all that work's been done.
Yeah, no, I think it's a great program. Yeah. Okay, I think is this wrapping up now, Beth, you think? Are we done? Dr. Lee, we're going to wrap things up if that's good with you?
Thank you, everybody. I love Angie. I love these conferences. It's so awesome to be able to, this for me is a great place to be once a year like this. I love it.
Yeah, we love having you. That's fantastic.
Nice to ground in and say hi, everybody, and share in what everybody's got going on. So that's always enjoy this.
So we'd like to thank our presenter, Dr. Mike, and appreciate your time here today. And we express gratitude to you for the wonderful work that you are doing. So thank you for that. The evaluation link is posted in the chat room if everyone wants to check that out and do your evaluation of this program as well as others you've attended. Also in our program is our YouTube channel, so you can see this program and all the other programs of our conference. That was part of the package of signing up for this conference. And you can go and watch these programs again. We'd like to thank our conference sponsors, PSC&G, New Jersey Natural Gas, our anonymous donor, and BASF Corporation, and the Grounds for Sculpture for supporting our field experiences. Reminding you, if you signed up for a field experience, they will be taking place tomorrow and Sunday.
Dress warm.
Dress warm. Yes, and bring an igloo. Yes. Yeah, so that's it. Thank you everyone for attending. We appreciate everyone's support. And again, Dr. Mike, that was just wonderful. I'm going to go sit for 5 now.
Nice.
So, yep.
Thank you so much.
And
Thank you,
thanks to
everybody.
Beth. Yep, thanks to Beth, our Angie director.
Yeah, Beth, thank you for everything you do.
Yep.
Of course. Glad everyone could be here. Thank you. Thanks, Mike. Thanks,
for all you
Laura.
do. Okay, you're welcome, Beth. We'll talk to you soon.
Take care.
Have a great day,
And that's a wrap.
everybody.